So it's not Thursday yet. How come? Okay, well, we're just going to have to settle with sex in the meantime. Sorry about that. Remember, like I told you in the beginning, it's all about sex and death. So, up in the left-hand corner is this book called Dr. Tatiana's Sex Advice for All Creation, or to All Creation, by Olivia Judson. Now, I know you're not going to go out and buy it, but you might want to check it out. Human sexuality is pretty conservative compared to a lot of other creatures. Most plants are hermaphrodites. You've got flowers with both the male and the female part. These little one-celled organisms called ciliates have separated sex and reproduction. And what I mean by that is that they actually have sex with another one, and they incorporate that other ciliate, like a paramecium. They incorporate the whole genome from that other ciliate. So now they've suddenly become like, it's like going from a common, it's like two people having sex, but they would both become each other, okay? Plus what they used to be, like the combining of both genomes. And then reproduction happens later when they split apart. They bud and create new ones. What?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. It's called parasexual. Almost sounds kind of sexy, but anyway, it's kind of strange. And then as far as animals, oh God, you just have no idea. But we'll look at some of that. What's going on over there? It's fun. Share it.
No.
Oh, come on. Please?
No, it's
Well, it's making you laugh, so I think we all, okay. Okay. So we talked about a little bit of this. There's some costs. First of all, there's a twofold cost. Namely that if you're asexual and you just reproduce asexually, let's say you have 10 individuals, they each produce one offspring. Now, if you're sexual and you have 10 individuals, well, I guess you could go 1 male and 9 females, but generally 5 and 5. So then you're only producing 5 offspring. And not only that, you're only half related to your offspring compared to a clone. Or like you, to your sister, right? You're completely 100% related. So, and then there's the whole thing about going out and looking for sex. It can be dangerous and expensive. In fact, just going out expending energy when you don't have to, like this being a clone and making a copy of yourself, puts you in danger. Now, benefits. Mutations spread more rapidly, but remember, mutations are random. So they could be good mutations, they could have no effect, or they might be deleterious to a certain extent, but not enough to kill you right off. And in terms of asexual reproduction, well, okay, hold on. Sex is favored in varied or changing environments. In other words, spatially, if you have a heterogeneous, like different kinds of environments, let's say forest here and a lagoon here and grassland over here, and you have an organism that can pretty much live within that area, but some genotypes might be favored in each of those different environments because they're better adapted to those specific environments. Or if the environment changes, you've got a lot more variation out there and something might win, whereas everything else might die off. And then clones, obviously asexual reproduction, you'd just be making copies of yourself. The only drawback is if you hate yourself. Twice as many offspring, and if the environment never changes, you're already kind of well adapted. Doesn't hardly matter. So you can take a look at this. So if we look on the left, sexual reproduction, you can only produce so many offspring, whereas with each generation, there's a doubling of the number of offspring that you can reproduce. So just from a fitness standpoint, in other words, leaving more offspring into the future, you can do much better just by asexual reproduction. And then we talked about sexual recombination, like crossing over and things like that. Well, if we look at this asexual rate up in section B, but number A, or letter A. So what has to happen is that you start out with A, but then you need somehow to get a mutation C on that same chromosome. It has to be a random mutation in the same place, which is highly improbable. And then finally, another mutation with A and B. And then finally, perhaps with that, you can get another mutation where you get A, B, and C. It's a very long, drawn-out process. You're waiting for the favorable mutations, and you may wait forever. So that's in terms of favorable mutations in the environment, it's a very slow process. With sexual reproduction, you start out A, B, and C. A and C mate, A and B mate, and then soon you're A, B, and C. It's much more rapid. Okay. So, in general, sex offers certain benefits and a lot of costs. And there's a guy named Kurt Lively who's at University of Indiana. And he's been working in New Zealand. Tough, isn't it, having to go to New Zealand to do your research? On these snails, aquatic snails, that are occasionally infected by a parasite. And the parasite pretty much makes them eunuchs. So they're just a bunch of, eunuchs floating around not being able to do much. Well, it turns out that if there's no infection in this little lake, let's say, the snails are doing fine. And in fact, they'd be out reproducing the sexual snails. But there's always a few that are actually popping up that are sexual. And if there is a parasite that invades, then it turns out the sexual stage will do much better against the parasite for that reason. There will be some that will be less susceptible to the parasite. And eventually, there will probably be a lineage that's absolutely immune to the parasite. Now, the thing is, these parasites come in different forms. There's the same species, but different forms in terms of their own genotype. And so these populations kind of go back and forth between sexual and asexual at the same time. So you can have a population that's sexual with male and female, and then a population that's asexual. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So let's see. Organisms that produce, what is that? I mean, I would say germ cell, but I'm not sure. Okay, we can at least, so gametogenesis, that means making gametes, involves what type of cell division? We just covered that. Come on. M? Something with M.
Meiosis.
Huh? Meiosis. Right. Okay. Now, here we go. So, let's say we found this new aquatic species, Sunii, that reproduces sexually. Individuals release gametes into the water where fertilization takes place. So it's external fertilization. Not much fun there. One parent is big, aggressive, and releases larger gametes. And the other parent is smaller, kind of cute, and releases smaller gametes. Which is the female?
A.
B? Yes. B or A? Female. Okay. It's A. It's A because, remember, eggs are a lot bigger than sperm by a huge amount, generally speaking. So just because in our sort of sexual reproductive system that the males are larger and they have small gametes, you can have a lot of cases where the females are bigger and have large gametes, and the males have small gametes. In other words, they've got small all the way around. Okay, so don't jump to conclusions about who's the male and who's the female. Okay, oops. So these are coral on the left, and they, the same species in the area, they generally time the release of their gametes at the same time. And not just the same day, but actually the same minute and hour. I'm not sure exactly how they coordinate it, but they release their gametes, and there's fertilization, and then these little fertilized eggs turn into larvae and kind of like drift off. There's also pollen, which is essentially plant sperm, and it too is a kind of a random event. It either relies on releasing pollen directly, which makes some people have allergies, or it is delivered by some kind of animal from one flower to the next. And then there's a picture of sperm and the egg. So external fertilization is pretty common. Some fish do it, like salmon. Probably never seen this, but they come upriver. They dig out a red, what's called a red, which is moving all the rocks of a certain size. They lay their eggs, and there's a big male there, and he comes in and fertilizes the eggs, or it's the jack salmon, and a little guy shoots in and shoots. So that's external fertilization. Now, I will say, I've seen this happen. The males, when they release semen, they kind of shiver, kind of like an orgasm. Whether that's what they're going through or not, who knows? Oh, and by the way, that's the end of their life. So after they've had sex, they die. It's called semiparity. It's kind of a bummer, isn't it? Yeah, it's sad. Of course, there's a lot of that going on in sex. You'll see why. So now, internal fertilization. One of the things in terms of the terrestrial environment is that it allowed life to move away from water. But there is internal fertilization in some creatures in the water. So it didn't necessarily begin on land. It didn't. It actually started out, it might have independently evolved on land, but it certainly started out in the ocean. Okay. You guys remember Nemo? Okay. Well, Nemo is a clownfish called the common clownfish. What is it? Ocellaris. I forget the scientific name. Anyway, these fish, what they do is they actually are in a symbiotic relationship with the sea anemones. So they can swim amongst the tentacles of the sea anemones and not get stung. And it's a safe place for them. It's not a mutualism in the sense that it's good for the fish, but I'm not sure what the anemone is getting in the meantime. But there's usually, in this case, one female and a bunch of males. Now, in the movie, it showed that Nemo, of course, was a male. Everybody's a male, even though males are actually not worth much in terms of clownfish. It turns out that Nemo probably would have turned into a Nema sometime in her life. So usually what happens is, with the clownfish, there's a bunch of juveniles that are sexless at this point. There's one male and there's one female. And the male is the most aggressive against everything below him, and the female is the most aggressive for all of them. Well, if the female, like in Nemo, her name was Coral, she got eaten by a barracuda. So her husband, Nemo's father, at that point should have turned into the head female, but he didn't. So the movie was incorrect. Like it's really important. But wouldn't it have been nice if you had seen a movie where the lead character changes sex during his journey, you know, from one place to another in Australia? I mean, that'd be totally cool. I mean, there'd be a bunch of Christians and stuff that wouldn't like it, but beyond that. Okay, so now there's another thing going on here. You probably hear of this occasionally, Marquis de Sade. But it's usually the men who are eating the women, right? Not the other way around, even though obviously women have generally more cause to kill the men than the women do in terms of human society. But there's something called sexual cannibalism, and it's actually a fairly common thing. The female is a very aggressive predator. When a male comes along, she usually grabs him and bites his head off. All the while they're copulating like crazy. And I guess he doesn't need his head anymore, so she just lops it off. And then she proceeds, after they've been copulating for a while, to eat the rest of them. And you think, God almighty, savages, just savages. Well, think of it this way. There's a bunch of other insects that a male brings a present to the female, like another dead insect, and presents it to the female, and while the female is chawing away on it, he's having sex with her. And usually the bigger the present, the longer time he has for having sex. So the more sperm he can inseminate her with. We do the same sort of thing with boxes of candy, right? The bigger the box, the better, right? I mean, don't you think? A little tiny box, like, from date, you know, not much. Now a ring or something, or, you know, a fur coat, I know that's against the law now, but whatever, something big and expensive, now that's really going to get you your attention, and you're probably more likely to have sex with a guy like that than some guy who gives the coat off his back, who's a poor hobo, right? Okay, so that's kind of what it is, right? You know? I mean, and you want to have an ostentatious show of wealth. Now the thing is, with the male getting eaten, the male has essentially become the present for the female. And all that energy and nutrients that are in him, is consumed by the female, can then be turned into energy to put towards offspring, many of whom are going to be his. So even though he gets eaten in the process, I don't know how he feels about this, in the long run, he's actually increasing his fitness. Seems a steep price. So, now, this is an anglerfish. Oh. And an anglerfish, you can't really see it here, we'll see it later. It's got a thing that comes out that it wiggles out there. And other fish come along thinking it's something to eat, and they grab on, and then she swallows it. So this is a she. These are he's. Males are essentially gonads. That's all they are. They're just a sack of sperm, period. And that's all they do is produce sperm. So here are these. Now, before the males get to the females, they're basically gonads with fins. So they can swim through the water. They find the female. They embed into the female, and then lose all function for everything else but producing sperm. So they're kind of like parasites, but they've been reduced to just a sack of gonads, which is really all men are anyway, right? I mean, we're just sperm delivery devices. The real work happens with females. I mean, I wish, well, you don't want men to realize, you do want men to realize it, but they are right now. That's why they really need therapy. There's all this stuff in the country about, you know, men are having a hard time. They don't do nearly as well in college as women do. So anyway, So there's all these different ways of having sex. Now, we, on the other hand, we start out as male or female, depending on which sex chromosome we've received, right? And then we stay that sex the whole time, unless, of course, you know, there's some problems. There's certain hormones like estrogen that feminizes a male that's released, and that's why you have a lot of people that are so-called transsexual, things like that. So, as I mentioned, egg is always the biggest gamete, and that signals a female. And of course, the egg is supermassive compared to the sperm. It's kind of like Jupiter compared to the Earth. There's many, well, they'd have to be bigger than that, but anyway, large. Could be the sun, let's say. So this is generally what's going to happen. Now, so, you see how cheap sperm are? And when most of them die, millions and millions and millions, each of one of those could have become another egg, become a human being, but no one seems to care. I mean, it's like they get completely, who cares if a sperm dies? It happens all the time. Eggs are more important, of course, and, you know, so in this day and age, it's like, you know, fertilized eggs are really important. But sperm, who needs them? Now, as you remember, sperm are produced by meiosis, and then eventually you go through meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and then finally you get to the point, meiosis, the telophase, anaphase and telophase part, and then each sperm has a single copy of each chromosome. And if you remember, with crossing over and everything, each of these chromosomes is unique, because there might be parts of it that have been crossed over with the other chromosome in, let's say, the male. And so there's a bunch of different genetic material there that gives sex so much power in terms of genetic variety. Okay. As you know, the sperm aren't just floating out there by themselves. They're floating in what's called the seminal fluid. Let's see. I think this is just a look at male anatomy. I don't think you have to really know much about it. So I guess this is erectile tissue, E. There's a bladder. Hold on a second. Oh, okay. Oh, I know what that is, I bet. Yeah. So this right here is a prostate. Vas deferens for A, I believe. I'm not sure. Anyway. So testes are the germ cells for males. And all they do is they produce sperm and seminal fluid. Along the way, they acquire this fluid, including the prostate gland. So that's actually what it's for. So, as the film mentioned, the vagina is a very acidic environment. So, when they're floating around in seminal fluid, they're protected. Okay, so this is the whole bit. Okay, so seminal vesicles. Oh, there's a prostate, my mistake. Prostate, that's more like it. This is the pubic bone. These are the vas deferens that carry the sperm from down here, the urethra, and then what's called the bulbourethral gland. So it's another part of the system that adds some sort of fluid to it to help the sperm. Okay. Now, in oogenesis, that's the production of an egg. In terms of humans, it actually begins in the female fetus. In other words, when you're just a little tiny embryo in your mama's belly. Meiosis, after they get to a certain point, pauses until puberty. And then, instead of producing 4 eggs, like you would produce 4 sperm, you produce 1 egg and all these polar bodies that are then, one of them is used to fuse with the male's polar body that has all the genetic material. So. Oh yeah, and so there's a lot of hormones, of course. For the males, they produce testosterone. And that production of testosterone accentuates certain male features because it's a very strong hormone. And then females have the other part of it, which is estrogen. Progesterone is only, well, it's mainly for once there's a pregnancy, for maintaining the pregnancy. Okay. Okay, so you can see where it all kind of happens. So normally 1 egg cell each month for females is released from the ovary. Now, in most animals, there's not continuous opportunities to breed throughout the year. In fact, having this situation where you have receptive females that are fertile at a certain time each month is really unusual. We just don't see it in other animals. So, for example, like deer, they'll copulate usually in the fall, and then they'll produce a calf deer in the spring. So, but they're only receptive and fertile in the fall. Sometimes it's also at that time. I mean, the males know who's fertile because they're the females that they come into estrus. For people, it's not exactly the same way. Now, it takes about 5 days to move through the oviduct, but an unfertilized egg is viable for only about the first 24 hours after ovulation. So In other words, it has to be fertilized within that 24-hour period. So sperm are viable for up to 20 minutes, 6 hours, 1 day, 5 days. I forget. What is it? Oh, 5 days. Oh, that's right, because they got a long way to go, right? So they've got 5 days to get to the egg in terms of when they're actually, the sperm is first released. So eggs are viable for the first 24 hours after ovulation. So during that period of time, the sperm have to fertilize the egg. So fertilization can result from sex up to 5 days prior to ovulation until 1 day after. In other words, there's a 6-day window per month that you're more likely to get pregnant. So some of the birth control pills, Plan B and Previn, they work by delaying ovulation. Okay? In other words, not releasing an egg when normally it is. So this is before fertilization. No, this is for unprotected sex afterwards. Okay. Okay, so as the fertilized egg is going down the fallopian tubes, it goes through a bunch of different rounds of mitosis, right? So from now on, you're going from fertilization to mitosis. And eventually, you'll end up with an embryo, and then the baby will be born, and it's made up of, obviously, trillions of cells that have differentiated. And you can actually see what it goes through. There's a zygote, 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, 8. Many cells, a blastocyst, which is really a hollow ball. The embryo is usually at the blastocyst stage when it implants into the uterus. Yeah?
So when a lady has a vasectomy, the sperm can get to the uterus?
Right. When a vasectomy, it means it never gets out of the penis. Vasectomy is for males. Tube tying is for females. Okay? So if a woman doesn't want to have any more kids, she can get her tubes tied. If a man doesn't want to have any kids or any more kids, he can get a vasectomy. I believe both are sometimes, you can reverse it. Okay.
Meaning if you change your mind, you can have kids again?
Apparently, but it doesn't always work. So they can go in surgically and try to reattach both sides. Because you're still producing sperm, and you're also producing the fluid. You're just not sending any sperm out in the fluid, right?
So does that mean that the vasectomy wouldn't be 100%? Like it wouldn't guarantee you that you're not going to have a kid?
No, vasectomy, that means no sperm is going to pass where it's been cut. Yeah. So this is kind of what happens. The hormones to support the pregnancy are HCG, what is the hormone HCG, which prevents menstruation. So if fertilization occurs, the embryo secretes that, and so you don't shed like you do normally, the endometrium. And then once implanted, the embryo stimulates formation of the placenta. A support connection between the mother and embryo. In other words, that's where the fetus gets all its nutrients. It kind of shares its blood flow with its mother, but at a certain point, it has a different form of hemoglobin that's even attaches even more strongly to oxygen. So you would expect that having traveled into the mother from the lungs all the way to the reproductive tract, that a lot of oxygen might have been lost. So the fetus, with its own blood supply, now the placenta allows things to cross that barrier. It then has this fetal hemoglobin that's a lot more active chemically. And then later, it's just regular, normal fertilization. Now, there's another hormone called progesterone that maintains the pregnancy. So the two big ones are estrogen and progesterone. There's a whole bunch of others, luteinizing hormone, a bunch of different ones that are all involved. So HCG is human chorionic gonadotropin. So that's actually, during a home pregnancy test, that's actually what you're measuring. So without that HCG, the female will shed the endometrium, she'll be having her period. So let's say you have 6, you don't want to have a kid, you can get Plan B or Previn. They both delay ovulation. You can also prevent ovulation via hormones, usually combination of estrogen and I forget what it is, but anyway, birth control pills. You have to take one every 24 hours. Depo-Provera injections, they last for 3 months. An implantation stick, an IUD. A lot of these different ones, some women tolerate better than others. IUDs now are small enough that they're becoming really common. So, then of course there's condoms. So preventing sperm and eggs from meeting, diaphragm, or abstinence. But the last one is really not an option, is it? I mean, not having sex? I mean, that's kind of dumb. We're humans, and we're like rabbits, that's all. And then, if you want to end a pregnancy, there's these pills. It used to be called RU486, but I know part of it is methotrexate and another drug. I forget what it is. Now, in a lot of places, women can get it through the mail, but they have to be in contact with the doctor, and they can do it at home to terminate their pregnancies. Obviously, in the very early stages. Now that Trump is in, Roe v. Wade is probably under threat, and they'll probably start putting people in jail when they get, RU486 through the mail. They'll be intercepted, and then they'll probably, put them in jail for illegal pregnancy if Roe v. Wade gets overturned. So then, of course, you'll have a lot of illegal backroom abortions, and a lot of women are going to die. Okay. So which of these methods do you think protects against STDs? The condom, yeah. Yep.
And abstinence.
Huh?
Abstinence.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, but that's the no fun option, right? I mean, look, I have met people who are kind of asexual. There's a whole bunch of variation, and then there's sex fiends out there. But yeah, it's pretty much, I would say, condoms. Now, a lot of people use diaphragm along with a spermicide, but of course that doesn't prevent necessarily against STDs. Okay. So, percent effectiveness. Abstinence. Now, it's true there's a 6-day window each month where a woman is more likely to get pregnant. But essentially, abstinence usually fails in the long run. So if you want to use this method, you might as well this is the one preferred by the Catholic Church. But even Pope Francis said it's like a woman doesn't have to have lots of babies. In the past, it was like the Catholic Church, wanted people to have 10 kids, 12 kids. I mean, God almighty, poor women. But he recently, a couple of years ago, he made kind of an off-the-cuff remark about, it was pretty funny about, women don't necessarily have to have that many kids. So abstinence, that's called the rhythm method. Mode of action, of course, is sperm, never contact, no associated risks, all that kind of great. A pregnancy rate without birth control is what, 85%. And then, of course, the other methods that we talked about. The pill works as 99% effective. So occasionally, women taking birth control pills will get pregnant, but not many. Now, in the past, yeah.
Is it true that if the female's always on birth control, it will be harder for her to get pregnant in the future?
Apparently not.
No?
No, but I don't know for sure. It might, but from what I understand, a lot of women do.
Oh.
Yeah, it's more, I think, a function of age. So the longer women wait, the lower their fertility is. Okay, so usually in their 20s, they're great. In their 30s, that's when they start to lose fertility.
In their 30s?
Yeah, yeah. So few women ever get pregnant at 40 or later. Let's put it that way. And those fetuses, they tend to not do as well. They tend to have more problems, all sorts of things, because maybe the genetic material is not quite as good. So yeah, that's why a lot of women nowadays who decide they want to have kids, but they don't want to do it right now. What they do is they take eggs. You can get the eggs from the ovary, and they can freeze them and then use them and implant them later. Okay? Yeah.
Would that be dangerous, or
What?
are they dangerous if eggs are frozen, or not?
I'm kind of deaf, actually, so I'll come back there to visit. Okay. Say again?
Is it more dangerous if women use their eggs, or?
No. It's pretty easy. Well, they have to get certain hormones to get the ovaries to release eggs. But from what I understand, it's not very dangerous. Was there another handout here? Okay. So, now in vitro, so anyway, it turns out that younger eggs women can carry them later in life, and they don't have some of the same risks with older eggs. Now, that brings us to IVF and in vitro fertilization. So, as you know, sometimes, try as they might, they can't seem to get pregnant. So they get tested. Now, it could be that it's the man who has the problem, and that's pretty much why they're not getting pregnant, so they try to do something about that. They might use a sperm donor or something. They might find it's a woman who's something's happening and she can't get pregnant. I remember Henry VIII, you probably heard about him. He kept killing his wives because they wouldn't give him a son. Okay? He needed a son to take over the throne. And so first one and then another, Anne Boleyn and a whole bunch of them. Each one gave him daughters, but no sons. It's probably him. It probably had something to do with his sperm, and it might have been something on, let's say, the X chromosome. And so he just wasn't producing the right stuff. And so even though he was killing all the women because they failed him, it was really his fault. Okay. So this is the first test tube baby. It was a long time ago. I remember when it first happened. I think it was back in the 70s. Yeah, 78. Where they actually took an egg out of the woman, fertilized it with sperm, and then reimplanted it back into the woman. So, how is IVF in vitro fertilization? That means in a test tube. Induction of oocyte maturation. So you have to use hormones to do it. And then depending on male fertility, the eggs can be fertilized or injected with a sperm nucleus. If you want to, you can look at that. You can see it. It's also on Moodle. So the zygote is then cultured and allowed to divide and produce an embryo. When the embryo reaches the blastocyst stage, it's then transferred to the uterus. Two to four embryos used to be transferred to increase the chances of a successful implantation. Yeah.
What's it called when, let's say, a female can't get pregnant because she might die? She's at high risk. So
Yeah.
they get her egg, they fertilize it with the male,
Uh-huh.
and they implant that fertilized egg with someone else.
Right.
What's that
Surrogate.
called?
Surrogate. Yeah. Surrogate female. Actually, a lot of women do it because they don't want to carry a baby to term, so they get someone to do it. Rich people. Yeah. Yeah.
How much does it cost to do that?
Yeah, a lot. So, in fact, I was going to talk to you about that. These fertility clinics, they're all over the place now. They're not very well regulated. And they soak people. Like each try is like $30,000. So you try and you try and you try, and obviously, I mean, you have to be rich to actually be successful with it. Yeah.
Does the clinic get the money or the person that gets pregnant get the money?
No, I'm not talking about surrogacy.
Oh.
Okay, so yeah, so the clinic for fertility treatments gets a lot of money, and then of course the surrogate sort of thing, they have to work out a deal, you know, between the surrogate and the mother. And so in that case, I don't know what the going rate is. It's probably fairly high, but it's also that person usually is in a position of weakness because she needs the money. And so she's going to go through pregnancy for return of the money. And in terms of risks, pregnancy is a far greater risk than taking the pill, getting an abortion, using any sort of methods to prevent conception, all that kind of stuff. A lot of things can happen because there's these strong hormones that are part of the whole process. And so one thing women often get is called preeclampsia, where they get very, very high blood pressure. Now, what they do is when women show signs of that, they usually start taking care of her and trying to bring that down because it could kill the mother. There's also, sepsis that can happen during delivery. You can get something called an ectopic pregnancy, where you get a pregnancy in the fallopian tubes and not the uterus. That can definitely kill a mother and a child too. So having children is a dangerous, well, it's got a certain risk to it. It's safer now than it used to be, yeah.
Is that the situation when they get caught in the fallopian tube that they have to choose between the life of the child or the mother?
That they what?
Is that the case where they have to choose between the life of the mother or the child?
No,
Okay.
no. They can, usually what they do is they determine there's an ectopic pregnancy and they usually end it right then and there. That means she can eventually still have kids, but yeah, no, they remove it. It's usually early, obviously, in the pregnancy. And it wouldn't last anyway because the right hormones aren't being produced. So there's no placenta, anything like that. But it can certainly, cause real problems. Okay. Now, so one of the things that was happening, of course, was that about 30% of IVF procedures produced multiples. Twins, which kind? Let's see, if they implanted different embryos, then it would be fraternal twins, not identical. So, and then you were getting, things like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, 8. So, 8 kids. All 8 squalling babies. Oh my God, this would be terrible. All at once. But what they're doing now, though, is they're getting better and getting better results. So now they're only usually implanting 1 embryo instead of a number. But still, these fertility clinics are really, they're not good. You have to really, if you're interested and need that, you have to do a lot of online searching to see which ones are, real. I would say, let's say there's a fertility clinic at UCLA. That's probably reputable. But a lot of, they're big money makers. Now, as far as you can do genetic testing of the embryo prior to implantation. You can also do genetic testing, by the way, from the amniotic fluid surrounding the baby. And then, of course, blastocysts can be frozen and saved for implantation later. So one of the things that's coming up now that you've probably heard about, a couple decides not to have another child, but they decide to freeze their embryos, and then they divorce. And then who owns the embryo? So there's been a number of cases like that. Is it the father? And then he's got to find a surrogate. Is it the mother? And let's say the father doesn't want a child, or the mother, you know, it's really a messy sort of thing. Now, all these IVF embryos, there's millions of them. They're stored. They can be used to produce what's called stem cells. Now, we're going to learn about stem cells. They're being used now in treatments for certain things. They're called stem cells because depending on their potency, which we'll talk about, they can turn it into any kind of other cell. So they are undifferentiated cells. The ones from embryos, those are the most potent stem cells, and they can literally they can be turned into any other cell type in the body. So we have a stem cell. That means it's undifferentiated. It hasn't gone down a path to become one tissue type or another. Stem cells also can keep dividing through their lifetime. And they can give rise to all sorts of different types. Okay? So, and then when they divide, of course, they're doing mitosis. And then here it shows, you know, there's a terminal differentiated cell. Okay, so an erythroid is a red blood cell. Hematopoiesis or immune cells, B cells, macrophages, T cells, part of the immune system, right? Myogenesis, muscle tissue, cardiomyocyte, neural, a whole bunch of different kinds of neural cells, signaling beta cell, and a chloroplast, a chondrocyte or osteoblast structural. So there's all these different kinds of cells in our body. And they can all be generated from stem cells. Now there was, of course, there was a big to-do, of course, because, we've got embryos now, and you're going to destroy embryos to get stem cells. Even though the embryos, remember, are only maybe 60 or 70 cells. They're in the blastocyst stage, right? So, yeah.
Stem cells form?
What's that?
Are stem cells
form? Essentially, an early embryo like a blastocyst, all those cells are stem cells. They're going to give rise to all sorts of different type of cells as they start to differentiate later on. So all those cells are actually stem cells at that point. And it's only later during the pregnancy that there's these instructions about, you know, turning certain cells get turned into certain types of tissue. Good question. So normally, of course, they actually replenish dead tissue. So our skin cells, they get replaced a lot. They don't live very long. And so they're replaced by skin stem cells. These are actually not stem cells that can differentiate into any other kind of cell, but they're in an immature stage. So most adult tissues also contain stem cells, but they give rise to limited cell types. So terminal differentiation at a certain point, or they can stop. Okay. So they've been trying to use stem cell therapy for a lot of different things, including, what is it? That brain disease. Anyway, so like they use it to contact muscle atrophy with aging, a number of different things. It really hasn't borne out quite the promise that it seemed to get earlier, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that experimentation with stem cells, learning more about them, was heavily restricted by George Bush. Obama's reversed a lot of that, but was at one point there was only a certain number of stem cell lines that could be kept running over and over again. But you need more than a few lines because these different lines of stem cells might have different properties. Stem cells are all about wound healing, let's say, and tissue regeneration. Now these are adult stem cells, not embryonic stem cells. That means this regeneration, these adult stem cells can only go so far. They can't turn into any kind of other tissue. They've already gone on a certain track and they're going to mature into mature cells. But this is where these mature cells come from, one of these stem cells. And so you see a wound like that, looks pretty ugly. These stem cells are at work producing new tissue. Now, there's a lot of organisms that actually can regenerate themselves. This is a planaria. It's a eukaryote, right? It's not a single cell. It's a thing about this big. You can take these and cut them up, and each little piece will regenerate into a new planaria. Okay, I think that's it, and we'll go on from here. So, as he mentioned, salamanders, these planaria that I talked about earlier, you can cut these up into different pieces, then they'll regrow a whole planaria. Same thing with some starfish. Of course, we can't do that, but they're working on it. And it's because they've got a bunch of cells that are in the embryonic stem cell state. And embryonic stem cells are the kind of cells that can actually grow into any other kind of cells, given the right circumstances. Salute. Okay, so you get a pretty good idea of what's going on there. Now, this would be great for spinal cord injuries, of course, that sort of stuff. But also other things. They've already done some stem cell work where they make kind of a matrix that the cells can then grow on that replaces a certain part. I forget what they've done, but a lot of different kinds of cells that they can kind of regenerate. So in terms of stem cells, they're not all the same. And what by that I mean is there's different potency in terms of what kind of stem cells they are. And by that I mean what kind of cells that the stem cells can give rise to. Adult stem cells are the kind that regenerate things like, let's say, your skin cells. They give rise to new skin cells. So it's not exactly what's going on here is not that the skin is all those cells that are dividing. It's the stem cells that are dividing, and then they become actual skin cells. So embryonic stem cells, though, can grow into any kind of tissue that you want it to. Okay. Right. So okay. Now, totipotent and pluripotent. The ones that mostly we use are pluripotent, and they're from the blastocyst stage. Totipotent means that not only do those cells become any other kind of cell you want it to, but they also are cells associated with what is it? This escapes me. The part of the embryo that's attached to the uterus. But that's not all that important. Look. So, oh yeah. They can form all the cells of the body and the placenta. That's right. Now, in terms of cells from the inner cell mass of the blastocyst, they're pluripotent. They're capable of forming all kinds of cells of the body, but not the placenta. Those are the ones that we're after. George Bush, when he was president, put a halt to embryonic stem cells, claiming that a blastocyst is a person. But they've been released from that. So under Obama, who knows what's going to happen now. Okay. Now, cord blood cells, stem cells, and placental stem cells are called what's multipotent. And by that I mean they have a capacity to turn into a limited number of cells, depending on what stage they're at. Okay? So if you take an infant's stem cells, they're at the adult stage, and they can grow into, let's say, neuronal stem cells, can grow into different kinds of neurons. Blood stem cells can grow into all kinds of different blood cells, including the red cells as well as the immune cells. So you have to distinguish between what's kind of limited in terms of multipotent and then embryonic. Now, one thing that is kind of gotten around, at least to a certain extent, that earlier ban on collecting embryonic stem cells was they've been able to induce multipotent stem cells to go back and become, in a sense, embryonic stem cells. But it's still not quite the same, from what I gather, as embryonic stem cells. Okay. So, as I mentioned, blood stem cells can become the red blood cells or the white, muscle stem cells, nerve, bone, different kinds of tissues. These are all multipotent. This is old, actually. I should get rid of it. So now, whether that's going to remain, you know, at least I'm pretty sure that embryonic stem cells are now open to doing anything they want, but I'm not exactly sure. Okay. Parkinson's disease. Anybody know what that is? Okay. Older people get it. There's these cells deep in the brain that start to decay. And so there's a whole bunch of neurological problems that go with it. You see people shaking. So they've lost neurons that control movement. They also have effects on cognitive ability later on. Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's. That's why he shook a lot. He lost the ability to speak. They actually learned about this way back. Remember that picture I showed you of me as a hippie? Okay. There were some drugs going around at that time that basically killed these cells, and they turned people into instant Parkinson's patients, but they're the worst kind. Did you guys ever see the movie Awakenings? With Robin Williams? You did. Okay. I'll go back to this bit with the patients and the drugs. But there's a movie. It was about this neurologist named Oliver Sacks who died recently. He wrote a whole bunch of different books. One of them was The Man Who Mistook his wife for a hat rack. Okay, because the guy had lost the ability. He had a stroke in the area of the part of the brain that recognizes faces. So we have a whole area of the brain that recognizes faces. But anyway, he was working with his patients that had gotten what was called St. Louis encephalitis from mosquitoes. And it had happened like 30 years before. They had all become kind of like unconscious and in a coma, and they had stayed that way. And at that time, there was a new drug called L-Dopa, which is used for Parkinson's patients now. And so he read about it, and he started giving his patients L-Dopa. They all woke up after like 30 years. And so he started talking to them, telling them what had happened. And they told him that they were like frozen in their body. They couldn't talk. They could hear, though. So they kind of knew in a dream state what was going on around them. It's terrible. So all of a sudden, they had this new life ahead of them. Unfortunately, L-Dopa, after you take it for a while, has certain powerful side effects that are not very good, including, one thing it does do is it increases sex drive, so that's fine. But the other thing was it tended to make people like paranoid and things like that. And eventually it also loses its effectiveness, and they went back into that state where they finally, years later died. So back to these drug-induced people, it was a kind of drug that destroyed the cells that cause Parkinson's, and these are the same cells that were destroyed or injured in terms of the patients that had St. Louis encephalitis. And those cells are the ones that kind of release L-DOPA. They secrete L-DOPA, which is a hormone. Well, these drug users, it killed all those cells, and it made them completely frozen inside their body. They couldn't talk. They kind of knew things were going on around them, but that was about it. I guess they woke them up with L-DOPA for a while, but it didn't, of course, last. So one of the hopes is that, and they've tried this with limited success, is you take implanted stem cells from this area, neuronal stem cells, they start producing dopamine. Dopamine transmits the nerve signals, and then suddenly it kind of cures the problem. Unfortunately, it hasn't been able to establish those cells so that they keep regenerating. An injection of these cells into the brain works for a couple of months, and then they're back to kind of square one. So most of the stem cells that we have are from in vitro fertilization. In other words, a lot of people, when they fertilize eggs for implantation into the woman, they often have a number of them, and so they store those. And in the blastocyst stage, about 60 or so cells. So those have been kind of the main source. Now, unfortunately, there were a bunch of cell lines that they developed, and then they weren't allowed to do any more, but now they are. Okay, so somatic cell nuclear transfer. Basically, it's called, you can do two different things. You can do reproductive cloning, in other words, a surrogate mother. So you take an egg from the egg cell nucleus is removed, you place it with a new nucleus that's been denucleated into the cell right here. So this one gets knocked out, and this one gets put in, and then you've got a clone, and that's how you end up with a stem cell with, let's say, perhaps the mother's DNA. I'm trying to think why they do that. Oh, I know. They put the mother's DNA, I think, into another cell, and then I'm not sure. I'll have to remember. Anyway, so you can do reproductive cloning. In other words, with a surrogate mother. That's what it is. So you take a surrogate mother's egg cell, you put the real mother's DNA in, and then someone else carries that baby. Okay? Now, there are real restrictions on what you can do in terms of reproductive cloning, like Dolly the sheep. Whether one day they'll do it with humans or not remains to be seen. You could see Kim Jong-un from North Korea making a whole bunch of little Kim Jong-uns running around. So instead of one maniac, there's 100,000 of them or something. But the bigger advance is what's called therapeutic cloning. And that's taking these stem cells, these embryonic stem cells, and generating them into different kinds of new tissue, whether it's heart tissue, or whether it's muscle tissue, or neurons, or whatever. So this is what they did with Dolly the sheep. They took adult udder cell and a mature ovum from one sheep, so the adult udder cell and then the mature ovum. They removed the nucleus from this one, so you just had a cell. They took the ovum out of this, so that's the nucleus, and that's then put into this ovum. And so basically what you've done is you've cloned the sheep. In other words, sheep number one. Okay, so that was what they did with Dolly. Now, it turns out Dolly wasn't all that healthy. And first generation animals that have been cloned tend not to be very healthy. They have a lot of problems in terms of mutations or certain things that make them they don't live very long. But it turns out that if you, let's say, cross them with another clone of from the same mother, that second generation is then fine. Okay, and you don't have to do this nuclear cell transfer. You just have a male and a female create a whole line of Dollys. Okay. So one of the things that's nice about somatic cell nuclear transfer is there's, in terms of therapeutic cloning, in other words, tissue, is you can then genetically match the tissue to the person who you want to make the tissue for. So you can take, let's say, their cells and put them into using this technology, and it'll be genetically matched. And that gets around one of the problems, which is rejection, tissue rejection, because of the immune system. So we're going to talk about the immune system. Oh, we're getting to it pretty closely. But the immune system, as I've mentioned, is very powerful, and it basically is there to determine self versus non-self. And sometimes it falls down on the job in terms of cancer. Sometimes it goes into overdrive in terms of autoimmune disease, which we'll learn about. Oh, that's it? Okay. So